Hi everyone. So this is just a video to give some advice on how to structure a law essay. It's based upon some of my slides and the materials that I give my students across all levels. And originally when I was, using this material, I was basing it largely upon writing for a summative essay. But I'm aware now that quite a lot of assessments are moving towards in-person exams, or maybe exams where you've got a very, very tight time limit. And this is largely due to AI. But nevertheless, I think quite a lot of the material in this would be helpful for anybody that's trying to prep for an exam and for writing an exam essay. And in particular, the kind of structure that we're looking for in a law essay and the kind of skills that we're trying to test. So I think to to help you understand what we are looking to assess when we write an essay, I think it's important to understand firstly what exactly a law degree is. Because I think very often we can be, people can be disheartened when they get a result back because their mark is lower than what they might have expected to do. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that very often we misunderstand the kind of things that we're trying to do in a law degree. So, for instance, before we come to law school, we might think that all we're going to be doing in a law school is learning what the law is. And obviously that's a part of a law degree. It's figuring out what the law is. And we very often have this image of people, you picture a law student, you think of somebody with their head buried in a book. But, and obviously you are going to be reading law texts, be that in a book or very often now online articles. But that's not all that law is. It's not just about learning legal rules. It's not just about knowledge. And the reason why it's not just about knowledge is if we were to take a step back and have a think about all the law that exists in the world, or even all the law that exists on a specific course, or even all the law that exists on a particular subject. So, for example, constitutional law, which is the area that I teach, or human rights law, it's impossible for you to learn all that knowledge. You're not going to be able to do it. Okay? Really, you're only learning a tiny fragment of all of the legal knowledge that is out there. Uh, so we might, I think, people have this image of education as, and particularly in lectures, which are a very passive way of learning, is somebody, as a student, you're just sitting back in your lecture theatre, and I, or your lecturer, is literally lecturing at you. We are telling you information, and that's a very passive way of learning. I like to think of it as you're like this vessel, and the lecturer is sitting at the front and is pouring knowledge into your brain. But again, you're not going to get all that knowledge into your brain because it's impossible. And the thing about law as well is that law evolves and law changes. So if law, the minute you graduate, you're obsolete. Likewise, if you're only learning the law in one particular jurisdiction, you're not going to be much use in another jurisdiction. I don't have a British law degree. I never studied British public law. So what am I doing teaching in a UK university? I think maybe quite a lot of my students wonder that sometimes, but nevertheless, they are kind of stuck with me. But the reason why is because if we look at the kind of things that a law degree is, we're not just about learning what knowledge is. It's not just about accumulating knowledge. Really, a law degree, it's about developing critical thinking and skills too. I like to think of law is kind of like proposed solutions to societal problems. Okay, so it's about identifying a problem and thinking what regulation do we need in this area, or it might also be what are the problems that the regulations are causing. So very often law is about problementation. It's about analysis, i.e., trying to identify what the problem is, and trying to critically appraise solutions to the problem or proposing particular solutions to the problem. And then law is also about argumentation. It's about convincing people that your solution to the problem is the best. Okay? So it's not just about thinking about what the law is, it's also thinking about what the law should or should not be. And if you are to be a solicitor or a barrister or working in a law firm or even doing public discourse, public policy, you're about critiquing the law and saying the law shouldn't be like this, the law needs to change. And it's about being persuasive. So if an essay question was really just about trying to assess all your knowledge, write down everything you know about parliamentary sovereignty, write down everything you know about the Human Rights Act, write down everything you know about the neighbour principle in tort. We're not going to be really testing these other skills. So an essay question isn't just about testing knowledge. It has to be about appraising all these other skills too. And that's why argumentation is important. And sometimes students go wrong in essays by essentially thinking, I'm just going to write down every single thing I know about a topic and I'll get at least some marks for knowledge. But knowledge is just one thing that we're testing. If you only do knowledge, we're not going to be able to score highly in all these other skills too. And so a key thing to figure out in a law essay, I think, is to trying to figure out what you need to include and what you need to exclude. Because again, think about all those books of law. You can't possibly know everything. You also can't write down everything in those books in an exam or in a summative essay, say where you have 1,500 words or 2,000 words. You have to drill it down and distill it down. And the way in which you do that, I think, is essentially to filter. And filtering really is to try and figuring out what you need to include or exclude in a question. And for me, there are kind of key questions to ask when trying to figure out what to include or exclude in a question. The first thing is to think about is, what is this piece of information adding to my argument? Can your argument stand without this information? Is this argument absolutely necessary or is this piece of information absolutely necessary for my argument to stand? The second thing to ask about is, can my, as I said, can my argument still stand if I admit this information? And then the third thing is, am I ignoring a key weakness in this argument? So very often that's quite common, is for students to maybe include lots of points in favor of their position, but then ignore the points against their position. If you ignore the points against your position, that's going to be a red flag to the marker to say, look, you've ignored all these. Essentially, you've not rebutted the counter positions. Now, note as well that I'm talking a lot here about argumentation and about the material that you're including in an essay is geared towards argumentation. And the argument needs to be directed towards the question asked. Okay, and if there is one key rule that we do in a law question, it's we answer the question that was asked. And sometimes when we see a question that says discuss, we think that means, we're just writing down everything that we want to know about the topic, but absolutely not. Discuss is normally in the wake of a very provocative statement, and it's asking you to whether you agree, disagree, or partially agree with the question. So it's looking for an argument, and it's looking for you to structure the relevant information around that argument. And that's why then I think these three key points for helping you to filter, for helping you to figure out what to include or exclude is important. On this point then, we have an issue to think about, which is depth and breadth. So depth is the idea of we're maybe making fewer points, but we're going into greater detail about the law, whereas breadth is about maybe trying to cover as many points as possible, as many different issues as possible. And really writing an essay is sort of like a balance between the two. You're going to need some degree of depth. You're going to need some degree of breadth. If we think of it in this way, according to this structure, the problem if you go too broad is that your points are going to end up very, very simplistic because you're covering lots and lots of different points. They're going to be quite simplistic. You're not going to have enough detail to go into them in I'm going to use the word depth here, insufficient depth. So a lot of the things you're going to be writing about perhaps will maybe raise more questions than they answer. And that might be quite difficult. So I think as a general rule, depth is better than breadth. Fewer points, but deeper analysis in those points. I think as a general rule is important. Really that's what an expert is. An expert is someone who knows a lot about very little. And likewise, you write an essay or even a dissertation, it has to be as narrow as possible. It has to be a question that you can answer in that small, limited space. So in general, I would say that depth is better than breadth. But make sure when you're narrowing and you're focusing that you're not ignoring maybe key arguments and key cases and key issues. So again, think back to that filter question. Is this necessary to make my argument stand? If I exclude it, is my argument getting, or does it look like I'm ignoring a key weakness in my argument? So it's a question of kind of a balance between the two, really. But in general, I think depth is better than breadth. Okay, and don't spread yourself too thin. I like the example of Bilbo Baggins in The Lord of the Rings, where he says that he feels sort of stretched, like butter spread over too much bread. And sometimes an essay can be overly descriptive because the student is trying to do too much, they're covering too many points, and they're not showing sufficient knowledge, depth of understanding, or analysis of all of those points. So, moving on then to how to structure an essay. So sometimes we like to think of an essay, or I like to give this example of the kind of things that students do in essays. So let's imagine that you're a maths student, and the maths student has been given the following problem. So they're asked to solve for x. And the question is, if 4x plus 7 equals 35, solve for x. So the maths student will answer this by going through the standard way in which you answer a maths question. And eventually they identify that x equals 7. Now, the maths student in this instance doesn't know what the answer is, does not know what x is until the very end. And so when you're doing your research journey, you might be tempted to structure your answer in a similar way. That you don't know what you think about a particular issue until the very end, and then you're like, okay, I'll structure my answer like this, and I'll leave I'll take the reader on the same research journey that I went along, and then in the conclusion, I'm going to hit them with this amazing conclusion that's going to knock their socks off. The problem with this is that if you structure your essay in this way, the marker isn't going to know what your argument is. We're not going to know what your point of view is. We're going to be quite confused. And so you're not going to maybe score highly on those argumentation skills or those analytical or those communication skills. So in general, I would strongly caution against structuring an essay like this. And in general, I would tell a student that you want to give away your answer at the start. You want to tell the reader what your argument is, because that acts as what we call the narrative. That acts to shape and to guide the reader throughout your essay so that we know what the point is. Okay? So you're not writing a novel here, so don't be afraid of spoilers. You give away the ending, I think, at the beginning, and you structure your answer in such a way around that ending to make it as clear as possible for the reader, and that the reader understands the point that you're trying to make. So for me, and this is just general advice, that a good answer will tell the reader in the introduction what they're going to argue. Then the main body of the essay will essentially tell the reader will do the actual thing that the essay promises what it's going to do in the introduction. So an introduction is going to tell the reader what the argument is, and it's going to signpost. It's going to say, in part 1 we're going to talk about this, part 2 this, part 3 this. Then the main body is structured around that, and then the conclusion tells the reader what they just argued. And in that way then, the reader understands what it is that you're trying to argue. Now, this is just one structure, but it's a very effective, a very useful structure, and it's a structure I would advise in 99.9% of essays. Some people in some other different modules, different courses might like a more, you can do some interesting things with legal writing and legal research, and you might get specific guidance on other courses as to how you could do it. Some, and you will see in some forms of writing that actually, taking that reader on the journey and then blowing their socks off at the end can be quite a powerful way of doing it. But it's a very difficult thing to do in a short undergraduate or even postgraduate essay, or even on an LLM. So for that reason, I tend to caution against that, unless you've been given specific advice that that's the way you should structure it. I would tend to structure things around this style here, and I would strongly advise checking it out. I think general structures to avoid as well are what I call knowledge dump paragraphs. So these are just sections of knowledge where a student is like, I know I need to write about this in this subject. I know I need to write about this in this essay. I don't know where I should put it, but I'm just going to dump it down somewhere. The problem with this is that knowledge isn't tied back to the question asked. So what that means is you're not going to get the argumentation skills. You will get some marks for knowledge, but you won't get the argumentation skills. And also, whoever's reading it is going to be going through it and thinking, what is the relevance of this to the question asked? Okay, and then your narrative, your argument can even get lost in this big descriptive section that isn't tied back. So I would try and avoid those knowledge dump paragraphs. The second thing I would strongly avoid doing is structuring your essay around the on the one hand versus on the other hand arguments. So, for example, having a structure that basically says section 1 will contain all the arguments in favor of a position. Section 2 will contain all of the arguments against a position. And then in conclusion, I'm going to tell you what I think. So I have an example of this in 4 questions, or sorry, in 4 sentences. So here's a very brief structure to a question: should the UK repeal the Human Rights Act? So, introduction: there is lots of debate on whether the UK should repeal the Human Rights Act. On the one hand, some people argue that the Human Rights Act gives too much power to an unelected judiciary at the expense of the democratic parliament. On the other hand, the Human Rights Act enables people to challenge decisions of public authorities that adversely impact upon fundamental human rights. In conclusion, I think the UK should not repeal the Human Rights Act. So, the main problems with this structure is essentially it's unclear until the very end whether the student is in favour or against repeal of the Human Rights Act. They've included information for and against, but they've not explained why they've gone for in favour of the Human Rights Act. They've not explained how the information in the on the one hand section interacts with the information on the other hand section. So essentially they've not rebutted some of the arguments. The arguments made in 1, they've not rebutted it by the arguments made in section 2. They've not shown how those 2 arguments interacted with each other. And it means then that the reader basically is over halfway through the essay until they get to the arguments in favour of the Human Rights Act. And so that makes it really difficult to follow. The argumentation skills aren't necessarily there. It's demonstration of knowledge of these arguments, but it's not necessarily demonstrating resolution of these arguments. So I like to think of on the one hand, on the other hand structure as something that looks a little bit like this. So if you look at of this side of on the one hand, okay, essay number 1 might be structured in this way, that we have an introduction that sets out the argument. We have the on the one hand section, let's say all the arguments in favour of one position are set out here in blue. On the other hand then, we have a whole load of arguments against that position set out in red, and then we have our conclusion. Now, the difficulty with this structure is that if you're arguing, say, in favor of blue, all your arguments in favor of blue are going to get lost in this whole section on red. Okay, so you're going to have a big, large part of your essay that doesn't really interact with the other part of the essay. And that means then that your argument is going to get lost. But there's a way in which you can include both sides of the argument to resolve this problem. So you can include both sides, but you're also getting forward your own argument. So the way I would advise structuring it is, well, let's say you're in favor of all the position. You're in favor of position blue, for example. And there's probably multiple reasons why you're in favor of position blue. And what you can do is you can structure your essay around these different arguments in favor of blue. So again, you have your introduction setting out your argument, but you will have reason one why you're in favor of blue, and you set out what reason one is. But you will also then, for every reason in reason one, there's probably a weakness or there's probably a counterpoint that you need to engage with. So you can include that argument here. And then you can come along and rebut it or engage with it and respond to it. And so you're bringing back in blue. Likewise then for reason two, here's your argument or your position in favor of it. Here's the weakness in that position, or here's alternative perspectives. But nevertheless, here's why you're in favor of your position. And the same with reason three. So in this way then, if we think of the blue as our argument, as our overall narrative, you can see then that we've woven it throughout the entire essay. Our argument in favor of blue has not been lost at any stage. But we've also not ignored the counterpositions. We've not ignored red. We've included red. We've just weaved it or woven it throughout the essay. And so that would be my main advice in terms of how to structure an essay, is to use this mode here. And then the conclusion again, as I've said, a good conclusion really, it should essentially just reiterate the main argument. Okay. And in general, there should be no new information in the conclusion. Okay, you're not wanting to go, hey presto, you're doing a magic reveal, or you're not doing a spoiler right at the end, a big plot twist. Usually, I'd strongly avoid that. There should be no new information. You're just reiterating what you said in the main body. That stated, there should be no new information that's kind of vital to your argument, that's necessary to make your argument stand. Sometimes, you can do new information that might point to areas for further research, or maybe areas of future development of the law. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, and particularly if you're writing a dissertation, a longer thing, that's very often a common thing to do at the end. That's absolutely fine, so long as your main argument isn't dependent upon this new information. That kind of thing, I think, is okay. But then we want to come back to think about our filtering and thinking about our word count. Is this kind of information absolutely necessary for my argument to stand? This might be the kind of thing then, if you are over the word count, that you're cutting down and you're saying, look, it's not really necessary, I can get rid of it. So again, these are just general rules of thumb. A good advice, I think, to write conclusions and just introductions in general and essays in general is to look at what journal articles do. If you read a journal article closely, you'll see a conclusion kind of does the thing that I've just set out. It tells the author what the argument is and it signposts it. And then the conclusion as well will set out the argument again. It'll reiterate it. And I actually think a very good advice for students, if they're finding it difficult to understand an article, is when they're after finish reading the abstract and introduction, if they go down and read the conclusion, that will also help them, before they read the actual body of the text, that might help them to understand the argument further. So really just have a look at secondary sources and look at and particularly journal articles, and have a look at what they do in the conclusion and just in terms of structure in general. So hopefully that's helped you understand the kind of key things that we're looking for when we ask an essay question, and bearing in mind, make sure that you answer the question that was asked. Another common mistake that students often do is they answer the question that they wish had been asked rather than the question that had actually been asked. So I would strongly avoid not doing that. That often involves a student going off on a tangent on something that they're really interested in, but the question didn't ask them to do that. Unfortunately, that's not the time or space for that kind of thing. So just be aware of that risk as well. So hopefully this has been helpful. And like I said, this is helpful hopefully just for not just for planning a summative essay, but also if you're doing essay planning for an exam. That thinking about how the key points that you're going to need to make, but also how are you going to structure it in such a way that you avoid the on the one hand versus on the other hand question. If you give yourself time before you put pen to paper to write your answer, to plan it out, and you should be trying to budget time in an exam to do that essay planning, because that's nearly half the battle, is actually structuring your essay in the first place before you actually getting around to writing it. So make sure you leave yourself ample time to plan an essay under exam conditions. Okay, don't just launch into it. It can be tempting to launch into it and write down every single thing. You're up against the clock. I need to get writing. No, plan, structure it, and that's going to be really helpful for you. Likewise, in writing a summative essay, leave yourself ample time to edit and refine. That your first draft isn't the draft that you submit. If you have 3 weeks to write an essay, you want to leave yourself a couple of days to get the editing down and getting refined, getting it reading nicely, getting your argument as clear as possible. If you're just writing right up to the very deadline, chances are your structure is going to be quite problematic. You might be repeating arguments. Your argument mightn't be as coherent or as clear. So leave yourself time for editing. Leave yourself time for planning. So hopefully this has been helpful. And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I've kept you for 27 minutes already. Thank you.